Hello students, today in this video we're going to look at solving literal equations. Another way you can think about that is solving an equation for a given variable. Okay, so for instance, let's say we're given the equation y equals mx plus b. Now you probably remember that equation from last year where it is the equation, the slope-intercept form of equation of a line, y equals mx plus b. Well, there are no numbers there. So sometimes we're asked to solve equations where there are no numbers and we're just trying to solve it for a variable. Because in this case, typically I'm given an mx plus b so I can figure out what y equals. Well, what if I'm given a y and an m and a b and I want to figure out what x equals? Well, I can solve for that x. So let's do that. We're going to solve for the x. Well, just wrap your mind around this and then pretend there are numbers or just act like there are numbers in there, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. We got to find what variable we're looking to get by itself, which in this case is the x, and then I've got to do all my opposite operations to get there. Okay? So I know I'm going to solve for the x. I'm trying to solve for x. So the first thing that I have to do is get rid of that b, because the b is not attached to the x. So I'm going to subtract b from both sides. And you're thinking, what's y minus b? Well, it's y minus b. Y minus b equals mx. Those b's cancel out, just as if they were numbers, and then I have y minus b equals mx. And now, m and x are being multiplied by each other because two variables next to each other is multiplication. And so I want to solve for x. Well, the opposite of multiplication is division, so I divide both sides by m. These m's cancel, and so I'm left with y minus b over m equals x. And so I've just solved that equation for x. Another formula that you might remember is the formula to find the perimeter of a rectangle. Perimeter of a rectangle is 2L plus 2W, twice the length plus twice the width. Well, let's solve this equation for L. And the instruction would say, solve this equation for L. Okay, so we need to get L by itself. So the first thing I've got to do then is to get rid of everything that's not attached to the L. And that's the 2W. So I'm going to subtract 2W from both sides. Those 2W's cancel because 2W minus 2W is nothing. And so I have P minus 2W equals 2L. Well, now I'm trying to get L by itself. So I have to divide both sides by 2. Okay? And so those 2's cancel out, because 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 1L, and remember the Council of 1508 tells us we do not have to put a 1 in front of the L. So I have P minus 2W over 2 equals L. And I have simply solved this equation for L. The next example we'll look at is the formula for volume of a cone. If you remember the formula for the volume of a cone, it's V equals 1/3 capital BH. Well, what if I wanted to solve this equation for H? Okay, let's do that. So, we know that 1/3 times B times H is what's happening. All of these are multiplication. The opposite of multiplication is dividing. So, I'm going to divide both sides by everything except h, because h is what I want to get by itself. So I'm going to divide by 1/3 b. And you're thinking, Mr. Collins, you put a fraction in the denominator? How can you put a fraction in the denominator? Because it's algebra. You can put anything in the denominator. Decimals, fractions, that's just what we do in algebra. Okay? So I divide this side by 1/3 b. Now, this 1/3 and that one, those b's cancel. So I'm left with v over 1/3 b equals h. Did you know that there's another way to do this one? Okay, I'm going to show you right over here. V equals 1/3 bh, and I'm still wanting to solve for h. So another thing I could do, instead of divide by 1/3 on both sides, what is something I could multiply both sides by to get rid of that fraction? If you said the denominator, you're exactly right. Typically what we do is if we have a fraction, we just multiply by the denominator. That gets rid of the fraction. Because 1/3 times 3 equals 1. So let's first multiply both sides by 3. So I'm going to multiply this side by 3, and I'm going to multiply this side by 3. So I get 3v equals, the 1/3 times 3 cancels out, and I'm left with capital BH. Now I can divide both sides by capital B because I want to get h by itself. Divide by capital B, divide by capital B. So 3v over b equals h. Sorry, that's 3v over b equals h. 3v over b equals h is the same thing as v over 1/3 b equals h. Either one of those would be correct. You just need to know when to use each one based on your answer choices. Welcome to the next installment of Wise Words of Wisdom from Mr. Cohen's. When you're solving equations that just look weird, go with what you know. Opposite operations. The way we solve equations is opposite operations. If something's being added, then subtract it from both sides. If something being multiplied, then divide it from both sides. If something is being divided on one side, then multiply it on both sides. Do those opposite operations even if it looks weird. Thanks for tuning in to Wise Words of Wisdom with Mr. Cohen's.